Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. You've heard the news and seen the headlines. Canadian Michael Spavor was convicted by Chinese courts of spying and has been sentenced to 11 years in prison. Recall that Michael Spavor is one of the two Michaels, Michael Kovrig being the other, who were both suddenly arrested in December 2018 and have been held in prison in China since then. The arrest of the two Michaels, and now the sentencing of one, has been called by critics as hostage diplomacy, in which these two Michaels are being used as bargaining chips. And for what? It seems to all boil down to the Canadian arrest and perhaps soon extradition of Chinese Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou. It's sort of like chess, but with rule breaking. Canada takes a pawn, China takes two pawns. Canada moves a rook, China moves two rooks. And what of all the Canadians in Hong Kong? Recall the Communist Chinese clampdown on the freedoms of Hong Kong through the passing of the National Security Law, which gave the Communist Chinese sweeping powers to clamp down on the protests and any actions against the Chinese government. Remember, there are over 300,000 Canadians living in Hong Kong. So what is Canada doing about all of this? What will Canada's response be to the conviction and sentencing of Michael Spavor? And what of Michael Kovrig? How should Canada respond to this ever-growing authoritarian regime? What is our next chess move? Joining me now to share her perspective is President of Canada Hong Kong Link, Gloria Fung. Gloria, thank you so much for joining me today. Let's jump right in. So not all of our viewers may be familiar with the two Michaels case, so could you please briefly remind us of the circumstances which led to the two Michaels being arrested?
In December 2018, Canada acted on the U.S. request to detain Huawei CEO Meng Wanzhou on fraud charges to fulfill Canada's international extradition obligations to the U.S. A few days later, two Michaels were suddenly arrested in China on trumped-up charges of spying. And the two Michaels have essentially been taken as hostages to pressure Canada to release Meng. So Meng's detention is in compliance with international law, and the conditions of her detentions are such that she can wander around in Vancouver wearing an ankle bracelet and host parties at her luxurious mansion there. And she can also employ a team of lawyers to defend her, where in court where the judge is in control. But on the other hand, the two Michaels have been detained in solitary confinement in Chinese jail without any access to family, legal counsel, and only very short occasional visit by consular officials. So the court process is, of course, a sham.
Well, now with the sentencing of one of the Michaels, some of us wonder, well, doesn't seem like a legitimate system, or this is very anti-democratic. How will the other Michael fare? Is there actually any hope for him?
Unfortunately, not much. In the past, evidence has shown us that over 99% of prisoners are convicted in Chinese courts. And furthermore, this is a political case, not a real criminal trial. China sees the two Michaels as pawns in the game. They will play them or sentence them one at a time. Each time, they will also, when they sentence them, it puts pressure on Canada. So eventually, they will also sacrifice the person they see as the second part. And the law in China is whatever that suits the best interests of the Chinese Communist Party. There's no fair judicial proceeding at all.
Right. Okay, well, we have 45 seconds left before commercial. I know this is a big question, but what do you think Canada should be doing?
Well, I think a lot of people have suggested that we should let Meng go in order to get the two Michaels back. But giving in to hostage takers sends the wrong message that hostage diplomacy works, and we would put a target on the back of every Canadian in China. So the only appropriate response to China's bullying is to work with our international allies, especially US, to send the coordinated message that when China breaks international law, there will be a price to pay. There will be consequences.
Right. Hi, welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on China, on Hong Kong, and what Canada can do. And joining me is President of Canada-Hong Kong Link, Gloria Fung. Gloria, thank you so much for, before we went to break, you were really explaining what's gone on with the two Michaels, with one being sentenced, the other one probably soon to be sentenced, what Canada ought to do. Let's switch gears now to Hong Kong, and obviously with your organization, you've been very passionately advocating for this. We've had you on before explaining what's going on. We just passed the one-year anniversary of the Chinese passing of of seizing control of China, basically, and passing the new law, the national law. What has been happening in the streets in Hong Kong and in the government? Can you please share with us?
Yeah, unfortunately, the national security law has become the supreme law of Hong Kong. And the Chinese Communist Party has sent officials to Hong Kong to be directly in charge of the crackdown on Hong Kong civil society. And ever since then, there's hardly any rally or march in Hong Kong ever since then. And these laws have no checks, accountability, or limits to its application or reach. And the government has been using the law to wipe out all dissident voices. They have been arresting a lot of dissident leaders, lawmakers, civil society organizations, as well as independent media in Hong Kong in the name of subversion and collusion with foreign forces. And so I think that is why Canada-Hong Kong Link and other ally groups in Canada have been advocating for the special life program to save lives of Hong Kong people under political persecution in Hong Kong. Yeah, and even though open work permit, open study permit policy have been announced by our government, but there are still extreme challenges for Hong Kong people to leave Hong Kong with the closing down of border and stricter exit policy implemented since August 1st. And therefore, we need to have more linear humanitarian measures to allow people to leave Hong Kong on special travel documents.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit more in a moment about what Canada should be doing there as well. But let's talk about the crumbled democracy that was Hong Kong. It was a beautiful democracy, and now it's no more. And you've explained how there's been the stamping out of any dissidents. Recently, the Hong Kong Civil Human Rights Front, the CHRF, has been disbanded, and this was like kind of the active voice against communist China for 20 years, the dissidents, if you will. Tell us what happened there.
Yeah, I think in the past 2 weeks, the Professional Teachers Union, as well as the Civil Human Rights Front, have both disbanded themselves after they have been criticized for potentially violating the national security law. They have been doing so in order to avoid being raided, arrested, or having their assets being frozen. And these two organizations are very well respected and very well supported institutions in Hong Kong. So they're the pillars of Hong Kong civil society. So with them being disbanded, that means there won't be any group or individual being visible and also powerful enough to hold the regime accountable.
Well, like you've said, that it seems to be no more protests, no more rallies. Now we have the longest kind of serving Civil Human Rights Front. The Hong Kong Civil Rights Front has now disbanded. And I understand why, like you said, the freezing of assets, the raiding, you would be arrested and thrown into prison and subjected to a court similar to what Michael Spavor just had. But if every single player in the democratic sphere goes away, and I understand why, there's a lot of pressure there, there's in threat of prison and gosh knows what else, what does that mean for the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong?
Well, with the silencing of dissident voices in Hong Kong, that means Hong Kong will be turned into just another mainland Chinese city, a big prison without walls, where people there could be arbitrarily arrested, charged, and convicted for crimes they have not committed, and in for a long period of time until they become insane or even die. The Nobel winner Liu Xiaobo's personal experience was a typical example of such treatment. So Hong Kong people have never been afraid to express their dissent and aspiration publicly and collectively. So the crackdown could disrupt the opposition in the short run. However, I do have faith that it will foster even more creative, resilient organizing, as well as tactics in the long run.
Right. Okay, I want to ask you a few more questions about Hong Kong and the status right when we return in just a few moments. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on Canada, on China, and Hong Kong. And joining me again is President of Canada Hong Kong Link, Gloria Fung. Gloria, it seems like many of us Canadians have been distracted with COVID, with lockdowns, and understandably so. But what's going on in Hong Kong is very important to Canadians. When you hear about dissidents, pro-democratic advocates being jailed and going missing and imprisoned, I think it's important we really understand what's happening. Could you give us an example of a story or someone you know who's been imprisoned or what's happened to them, just so that we can really paint that picture?
Yeah, I know a pro-democracy lawyer who has been convicted with collusion with foreign forces, and he has been put in jail for a few months now. He has been in solitary confinement, and the space of that a cell is very small. I think it's around 6 by 6. And the temperature is extremely high because in summer in Hong Kong, the temperature could be as high as 35 degrees or even 38 degrees. So he has been sweating a lot and the food is terrible. So he has lost a lot of weight. And he has also been forced to labor in a laundry compartment where they have to wash all the clothing and iron the clothing. So basically, there's no rights at all. And they are not allowed to speak to other prisoners.
And this is a lawyer, a pro-democracy lawyer.
Exactly.
Wow.
And he has been defending the rights of defenders in Hong Kong and China, as well as lawyers in China.
So what does this all mean then for Canadians on the ground in Hong Kong, dual citizens?
Well, yeah, I think Canadians living and working in Hong Kong will be subject to the same dictatorial policy because national security law applies to Hong Kongers and foreigners all alike. China does not recognize dual citizenship, so any Canadians born in China or Hong Kong will be first and foremost a Chinese when they are on Chinese soil, according to the Chinese foreign minister. So Canada needs to do better to provide consular protection right to these people working and living there.
And again, why should Canadians be concerned?
Well, there are more than 300,000 Canadian citizens in Hong Kong, and their security is deeply threatened along with everyone else in the city. Defending Hong Kong people's freedom and autonomy is also defending the rights and security of Canadians living and working there. Hong Kong is now at the forefront of its fight against the Chinese communist dictatorship that poses major threat to global democracy. If we keep this flame of freedom alive in Hong Kong, there's a chance for it to spread to other cities in mainland China.
Right.
And that's why Canadians cannot just step back and pretend that it doesn't matter. Because the struggle for human rights and democracy is a global struggle. Loss of freedom anywhere hurts us all.
That's very, very well said, Gloria, truly. Let's switch gears a little bit to Taiwan. So we've known there has been increasing encroachments, if you will, from communist China to Taiwan. Very recently, China carried out assault drills near Taiwan, which included warships and fighter jets. And their response from China was, quote unquote, this was a response to external interference and provocations. And we know that there's been a lot of activity in the past 2 years near the Taiwanese waters. How do we respond to this? Are we going to see Taiwan fall next?
Well, I would say China always see Taiwan as part of China under the so-called one China policy. But for us, we always consider Taiwan to be a totally independent political entity in itself. And there's also democracy in Taiwan. And that is why China hates it so much. And I'm afraid Taiwan, after the fall of Hong Kong into the communist hand, now Taiwan has become the next target. And this is a particular case when the Taiwanese government has extended so much support to Hong Kong people who have fled there for refuge. And there are, I think, probably hundreds and hundreds of Hong Kong people, staying in Taiwan right now, either as students or as, temporary workers, just political refuge there.
My goodness. Okay, we're going to pick up our discussion right when we return. Please stick around. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion on Canada, Hong Kong, and China, and what the emerging threats of China means for Canadians and for those even in Hong Kong. But joining me is President of Hong Kong, Canada Hong Kong link, Gloria Fung. Gloria, before commercial, we were talking about the encroachment on Taiwan, these latest assault drills taking place by the Communist Chinese in the waters. What about the Olympics? We seem to forget that less than 6 months from today, Beijing will be hosting the Winter 2022 Games. Many countries, many agents, even actors, have called for a boycott, citing the many human rights violations, whether we're talking about the Uyghur Muslims or the breaches of law in Hong Kong, and even for the Canadians, for the two Michaels. What message would a boycott send?
Well, the Olympics are not just a sports event. Starting from Hitler in 1938, dictators have been using Olympics as a way to build national pride and prestige worldwide. And China is now using it as a propaganda for domestic and international audience. Therefore, boycotting would send a strong message that Canada does not want to join in a propaganda exercise to support a country that bullies us. And that has no respect for human rights anywhere.
It's funny you should mention that, because I've had discussions with some friends and family. Should there be a boycott? We just finished, obviously, the Summer Games in Tokyo, and we love it. It's such a unifying event, and I would love for the Olympics to simply put aside all politics and just literally have the celebration of sport. But it seems almost impossible, and you're right to bring up when Hitler hosted the Berlin Games. I also remember in 1980 when there was the Moscow Olympics, and the US did boycott those games. So thinking about that, is a boycott actually likely? Again, the US did this in the 80s, as recently as 40 years ago. Is it actually likely?
Yeah, I think we should try different avenues to achieve our purpose of punishing dictatorship. And public support is actually indeed growing for boycott. And the more we push our government, the more likely it will happen. Or at least we should send a strong message to the Chinese Communist Party by sending athletes only and no government representatives. Athletes might also wear symbols of resistance at the opening ceremony or on the podium, which would draw international attention and counteract China's propaganda message. Alternatively, Canada can also work with other allies to advocate for postponement of the Winter Games for a year and relocate the host to a different country.
So I guess with that in mind, we're in an election period right now. The writ has been called, the election has been called. We're going to the polls September 20th. This is going to be an election issue. I'm convinced, especially with these latest assault drills that have been taking place. China will factor into our election. How seriously do you think Canada has taken the threats from China? And what would you like to see happen in the minute or so we have left?
Well, I think our government has not spoken out forcefully and frequently enough. and its actions have been hesitant and inadequate. And furthermore, it has underestimated the danger posed by Chinese agents in Canada who have infiltrated and manipulated political parties, academia, and civil society. And the CCP is also intimidating and suppressing our freedom of expression on Canadian soil. So I think our government has not done enough to protect Canadians' rights and also our values, democracy in Canada. So it's very important that in this forthcoming election, Canadians should come forward to vote and also to have our voices heard that we need a stronger foreign policies towards China. And we should also continue to stand with Hong Kong because Hong Kong is at the very forefront fighting against Chinese dictatorship. And if this frame remains alive and we can keep it growing, if we let it die down, it will also hurt our own democracy eventually.
Okay, Gloria, thank you so much for joining us today. Excellent words. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me today.
The fight for democracy in areas controlled by communist China is real. We've seen what's happened in Hong Kong. We now have the sentencing of one of the two Michaels, and now we're hearing of these new assault drills off the coast of Taiwan. The fight for democracy is a real thing, and Canada, I believe, ought to play a bigger role in making sure we preserve and promote democracy globally. It will for sure be an election issue. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.